in physics, I think I'm paraphrasing Einstein or somebody like that, that said that the definition is not primary. The theory is primary. So the theory is essentially the explanation of what we think a city is. And we put it in math and derive consequences, but basically it's the idea of what a city is as a mechanism, as a process. And then the definition follows from the theory. You don't start with definition and derive a theory. That never works in any field. And so that I think that that's the problem that, across the community we're having with cities, because there have been a lot of administrative and other definitions by geographers and so on without theory, basically, or without explicit theory. And so when we came along and came up with these ideas that are sort of supported by all this evidence from around the world and across time and so on, the theory essentially is city as a co-localized network over space. So it's really about the interactions of people over, at a certain temporal frequency on a daily basis, basically, over these built spaces. And so in order to do that, you need to come up with a definition that makes sense. So the problem, so that then takes us to a practical problem about what's the extent of the city. So there's this rule of thumb that comes from geography that the extent of the city is about an hour travel. It can be more. You see that in cities that are developing where people spend more time, but 1-2 hours, something like this. So, but 1 or 2 hours depends the distance and what it includes. Varies tremendously depending on whether you use a car or you use a fast train or subway or whether we walk, right? So if you walk, it's easy. But otherwise, you can cover easily, 100 miles or something like this. Or, in other units, over 150 kilometers or something, like in 2 hours if you're not unimpeded, right? So that's a huge distance, right? And that means that a city does not have to exist as a compact, dense core, but starts having all kinds of sort of surrounding suburbs that can exist at lower densities, as happens in the US and starting to happen in India, and even satellite towns and so on, that if they're well connected with trains or subways or whatever, that becomes possible. So that's the problem. This problem actually was understood in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, at the time when after the war, the United States was building all the highway systems and people were buying cars. And because the census of the United States realized that they had been measuring metropolitan expansion since the beginning of the 20th century, and they found that they needed to extend the definition to include essentially all the interaction population with cars. So they came up with this idea of metropolitan areas, which are basically commute zones. So if you start doing now the commute zone, these are all the people that are interacting on a daily basis. And that's the definition we've always used. And that's what economists use and so on. It's this functional definition.